Thanks everyone for joining. And Lars Panaro has joined me after quite a while, and I'm doing a video after quite a while. So thanks, Lars, for joining me again. It's going to be a wonderful session, I'm sure.
Thanks for having me.
So the world is keenly watching the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and I think we've all been following the news, and we've been quite closely following the astrology as well. So last week, probably the last weekend, I posted an article on Russia-Ukraine conflict about what I think might happen, and we also had a conversation even before I wrote the article. So we went through the charts, and it was things were quite revealing. So there we are. So as a result, we are here trying to explain things from an astrological point of view, and this I don't want this video to be whatever we say is basically astrological matters, and so it's not an opinion of neither parties like you or me. So that's one thing. So there is no bias. It's purely astrology. So I think we can just start right away by sharing the screen. So right. It's basically a big, not even war of words, but a war of silence between the Russian President Vladimir Putin and the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, if I'm pronouncing correctly. But I'm not sure if they've been involved in any kind of talks since the beginning of this, or probably even since 2014 when Russia took over Crimea. But it's quite tensed at this point. So this contents page is all about like what we are going to talk about over the next half an hour or so. So if anyone has been following my work, they would know that I'm currently working with chakra dasha on a very intense manner, and I'm just trying to take it beyond its natal usage. So, and after working with it for a while, it's clear that we can use it quite flexibly for mundane charts as well. And when I say quite flexibly, we can just compress the dasha system based on the number of years that we want to look at the astrology for. So and another thing is like Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. So Jupiter-Saturn conjunction is it's probably the most important astrological event that can occur for astrologers to kind of have an astrological opinion for a longer period concerning socio-economic or socio-political issues that might actually bring about a major change in the way people live, or in the way society functions, or in the way government functions. And many people would not use Jupiter-Saturn conjunction charts for war. And I'm not sure if people use even conjunction charts for war. People just look at the transits, or maybe the natal charts of the nations. So the reason why I don't want to use natal charts for nations is because there are so many events that might occur in the nation that might actually supersede the significance of its own independence, or probably even the formation of the constitution. So if you take for US, there are around 10 to 12 charts that people use, which is basically so confusing even from the beginning itself. So I wanted to kind of it is my own skepticism. I don't mean to say that the natal charts for nation don't work, but it's my own skepticism that I don't want to use natal charts because I'm not very sure if it is worthwhile or if it is correct using the natal charts for a longer period or a longer picture. Because, for example, US was formed in 1776, and we are almost through close to 250 years since US was formed, and we don't. I mean, it's undeniable that the US has gone through colossal changes in terms of socio-economic and socio-political and probably even geopolitical um, standards. So, so I thought it makes more sense to use an astrologically significant chart to replace the natal chart, like a natal chart for a nation. And a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction shows the socio-political and socio-economic changes or shifts that occurs in the governments, in turn the society, and ultimately with the people, uh, is probably not is necessarily, but could be a result of a war, or probably will result in a war. So it's a circle. We can never kind of say that this is the result of that or that is the result of this. But I think war is certainly a major part of Jupiter-Saturn conjunction chart because it results in a socio-political or a socio-economic change. For example, if Russia invades Ukraine, it brings about a major economic crisis in Russia because of the sanctions that the West is going to impose. And Ukraine is going to face basically survival crisis. And it's a major socio-economic shift from what they currently are facing. So the living standards and the lifestyle of the people are going to drastically change if there is an invasion, which is very unfortunate. But my opinion is that the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction chart kind of beautifully reflects all these factors because the world revolves around economics and politics. And Jupiter-Saturn conjunction shows major shifts or changes that might happen in both economical and political fronts. So, did you want to add something to this, Lars?
Sure. I think that a great example of what you were talking about with regard to why using birth charts of nations or even cities or things like that can be problematic is because in the United States alone, the capital used to be located in the state of New York, and now, of course, it's not and hasn't been for quite a while. But that's originally where it was, and actually, the medieval astrologer, scholar, and practitioner Robert Zoller worked with a New York-based chart and New York-based location, I believe, even for his Aries ingress charts and whatnot when he was making predictions for things such as September 11th, for example. So again, and then so on. Like some people use the chart for when the government of the United States was like, I don't know, I guess more concretely set up, which actually occurred a couple years later, and so on and so forth. So yeah, there are the same kind of problems for pretty much every nation, unless you had, literally astrologers there working with the leaders, like you did with I believe it was it Baghdad that some astrologers were so in that case you had the the leaders of the country or the culture at the time have some astrologers come up with a foundation chart for building the city of Baghdad, and so in that case that's a more accurate kind of thing. But then again, like we can never be so certain about any of this because it is really clear when a person takes a first breath after coming out of the womb, but it's not necessarily clear like what marks the beginning of building a city or making a country. Is it the first like shovel hitting? Is there a ritual that's performed? I mean, so anyway, I just think that's interesting. And so looking at the Jupiter Saturn conjunctions and casting them as you've done for particular nations to get a sense of what that nation and that people are going to go through in the next 20 years, I think makes an abundant amount of astrological sense. And um, this is, I'm going to move us a little bit forward and say that as I was thinking about what what houses and what significators to use for looking at the possibility of war, I felt like intuitively that we want to emphasize houses 6, 7, and 8, as well as of course Mars, the significator of war, because houses 6, 7, and 8 in the chart of like a nation or a people, the sixth house, among other things, does symbolize both the military and service men and women, but also enemies,
Yeah.
in the sense of enemies that want to cause you harm. So it could also be a house of, terrorists, so to speak. Um, if you understand the real meaning of that word, not the neoconservative way it's thrown
Yes.
around in
Right.
the United States, which is, yeah. Anyway, seventh house is other nations, right? Especially any other nation that is having a direct bearing on the fate of a particular nation, and the chart we're looking at, right? So it could be the nations that the country is doing trade with, that the country has alliances with on some level. Not in the same way that the 11th house would show like an actual alliance, like an actual friend that you can count on in war, but in the sense of like, okay, we have a treaty worked out here, so it's more like a neutral kind of deal. But yeah, any sort of deal or contract, right? Because it's like nations can get married too by having contracts with other nations and so on. And then, of course, the eighth house is the house of destruction par excellence. So the eighth house to me is kind of the house of war, because it's the house of destruction, death, destruction, and, hopefully arising from the ashes. But and then of course Mars being the natural significator. And I know that there are a few other factors that have been prominent in the charts. So if you want to comment on any of that before we move
Uh,
ahead.
so just a quick addition to what you said. I think 12th house is also super indicative of war, and I basically use 12th house as war and 8th house as a catalyst to war. So I use 12th house for war and hospitalizations, but I can certainly understand why 8th house and the 6th house could also play a major role in terms of a war building up and also progressing. So it's, I mean, at the end of the day, all these three are evil houses. If people like the black and white way of differentiating things, but
Yeah,
uh,
certainly it makes sense to include the 12th as well. Now that you mention it, because yeah, hospitalizations and things like that, breakdowns, social
yes,
crises are afforded to the 12th house. So yeah, a war is certainly very much a social crisis in the right circumstances. Well, no, I don't. Sorry, what I mean to say is that um, what I mean by right circumstances is that like it's a different reality if the war is not on your home soil,
yes,
right?
yes, yes,
If it's like far away kind of a thing. So it still can be a social crisis, but it may not be a social crisis in the same way it is for like the other country that actually where the war is physically taking place
right,
per se. I mean, this is something that has, I think, happened increasingly with modern warfare, but especially in the United States. I mean, this country has has seen its fair share of warfare and invasions and whatnot, but in the past 20 years, we've been, since September 11th, we've been doing stuff all over the world, and we really haven't seen um, direct attacks on the country, except for September 11th, which that's a whole nother
right, yeah,
thing. But anyway, aside from things like domestic terrorism, which I'm not talking about. Again, not how neocons define it. I would define domestic terrorism as what happened on January 6th with the insurrection on Washington, D.C. Those to me were domestic terrorists, much more so than many of the people who have been cast as being domestic terrorists. So,
yeah, I mean, it's an intense topic, and so right. Apart from that, I think the one point that we may have to mention is the nodal axis, where so I think we have worked with 1, 2, 3, and 4 Jupiter Saturn conjunction charts, and in all these Jupiter Saturn conjunction charts, we have all the planets placed on one side of the nodal axis, which is basically a Kala Sarpa or Kala Sarpa dosha. So Kala Sarpa is basically activated when all the planets fall on one side of the nodal axis. So in some of the cases, you might find that at least one planet is outside the nodal axis, or one planet is closely placed in the nodal axis but falls outside the nodal axis. It's not on the other side where all the other planets are placed. So in such cases, it's quite it's quite tricky to kind of deal with. It's quite difficult to understand. But one of the other things to see is the planet that is actually not placed in the nodal axis might easily get into a relationship with every planet that is actually placed in the nodal axis. So inside the nodal axis. So especially unless and until it is an aversion, the planet that is on the other side of the nodal axis is going to invariably form relationships, various aspects with each and every planet that is placed on one side of the nodal axis. So that particular planet turns out to be very important, and any planet that is placed on the nodal axis in conjunction with either of the node also becomes very important, because nodes alter the balance very vastly. So, and it's quite unpredictable in terms of how a planet would function or what a planet would indicate in that case. So.
I think I was just thinking of it's interesting because we're Mars, of course. Yes, we have to look at Mars. That's obvious. But in your research, you've found that the nodes seem to play a prominent role, and especially this Kala Sarpa situation, or near Kala Sarpa situation in a lot of these charts. I mean, it's truly fascinating. And I think some of your research suggests, if I remember, that the nodes switching places within the they're nine years into the Jupiter Saturn conjunction, right? They'll switch places roughly, and so that also seems to be a possible trigger point. And then we'll talk about Saturn too a bit, obviously, but it's reminding me of so I'm slowly making my way through the Mahabharata finally, and I'm at this part, and I wanted to bring this up for people listening, because the nodes kind of have this like odd reputation as being like very, very karmic. It's like actually everything in the chart is a representation of karma. And so I think a lot of Westerners get carried away by this kind of like the nodes being somehow more indicative of some kind of karma. And I would say classical Jyotish doesn't necessarily completely disagree, but it's more just that the nodes are stronger indicators of complicated entanglements, and so in that sense more karmic. They're stranger, they're less predictable, they kind of represent the unpredictable element in classical astrology, where there's some wiggle room within the realm of fate and free will and all that. And so in the Mahabharata, there's like kind of there's this backstory going on for why there ends up being such a huge war, which
Yes.
is where the Bhagavad Gita comes out of, for those who don't know.
Yeah.
And the war in that story comes out of, right, is, so it's like, there's all these there's all these little trigger points that keep lining up, and I can kind of tell where the story's heading, because it's like you have one character, Bhishma, who became celibate so that his father, the king, could marry like a non-royal woman, and then a problem came because he died before he could produce
Yeah.
offspring. So then they wanted Bhishma to produce offspring and to rule the kingdom, and he was like, I can't. I've made a vow, blah blah blah. I'm not supposed to rule, and I'm celibate. And then so then they get the sage Vyasa, who supposedly wrote the epic, to produce these grandchildren, but because of the way the women, the princesses, so to speak, react to like his the way he looks, because apparently he's not very good looking. um one's born blind, right, and
Mm.
then one's born like very pale, and then one they try to have them make a third one, but the one of the princesses sends her maid instead, and so you get a third one that can't inherit the throne, right? The blind
Mm.
one can't inherit the throne,
Sure.
right? Dhritarashtra, and Vidura's not born of the royal line, so he can't inherit the throne. So then Pandu is the only one that can inherit the throne. And I just got to this part where Pandu has a curse laid on him, and so he
Yes.
renounces everything and becomes a forest wandering ascetic.
Right.
So now he's trying to have children, I guess, is the part of the story I'm at.
Yes.
But it's just like, oh my God. It's like, no wonder there eventually was a war, because Dhritarashtra has 100 sons and one daughter, but he's blind, right? So
Yeah.
he's not supposed to really. Anyway, so Ashwin, you know the story better than I do.
Uh,
Obviously, I brought this up for anyone who watches this video to say that is a good example of the nodes wreaking the
right.
havoc that causes war.
Yeah.
That story.
And as you mentioned, I think Mahabharata is kind of a great example of how greed can lead to so many destruction, so much of destruction to the society, and you cannot separate Rahu and greed. So one side of the nodal axis is
Right.
all about greed. So
Yeah,
it's
you gotta have
quite,
more. It's
yeah,
never
yeah,
fulfilled.
yes,
Yeah.
it's
And
just
then
living in this,
Ketu is
yeah,
kind of this inability to deal with things in a way, like this, like, no, I'm just gonna go into the forest, guys, and
yeah,
not have any children and not rule the kingdom or whatever it is, like Ketu is kind of that other side of the coin, where in our own lives or in politics or anything, I think where we have a tendency to like ignore things or push things away, not want to really deal with the results of the greed and the obsession symbolized
sure,
by Rahu. So there's a lot in this. There's a lot going on in this, and yeah, Rahu Ketu always have some sense of selfish, self-serving actions that wreak immense havoc.
right, yeah. I mean, havoc in the sense they have to create some imbalance in the society that is already thriving to have balance.
Yeah.
So, and
And the nodal cycle itself is also a 19-year cycle,
yeah,
roughly, right? So it's actually very close to the 20-year Jupiter Saturn
yeah,
cycle. So in a sense, we two intersecting, interweaving cycles, which makes it even more enmeshed, more complex.
right, sure, yeah. So maybe we can just move on to a little bit of description about how to use
Sure.
chakra dasha, because I don't want to get into a deep digression by explaining what chakra dasha and how chakra dasha works. But I just want to give a gist to people, because I've already written so many blog posts about how to calculate the periods and how uh, chakra dasha works for both natal and mundane matters. So if anyone is interested, can probably go to the blog and just revisit uh, the workings of it. But I just want to kind of quickly explain how it works in a Jupiter Saturn conjunction chart. So for like chakra dasha was given by Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra. By Parashara and his Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra. And chakra dasha is a period of 120 years where each planet rules, each sign rules for 10 years. And the planet that rules a particular sign becomes the time lord. So I think Parashara does not talk about the Antardasha rulers or sub-period rulers, but I think I've taken the liberty to kind of bring in the sub-periods into the major dasha or major time lord periods. So every dasha is quite flexible if you want to compress and expand. So what I did for the sake of using it in a Jupiter Saturn conjunction chart is I compressed the dasha period into 20 years. So a Jupiter Saturn conjunction cycle is for 20 years. So we have to divide the 12 signs and we have to equally distribute it to each and every sign spread over the next 20 years. So in that case, we will have, for 20 years, we have each sign ruling 1 year, 7 months and 27 days. So chakra dasha periods are equally divided among 12 signs. When we calculate the dasha periods for 20 years, each sign will rule for 1 year, 7 months and 27 days. So that's basically the major dasha period. And if we calculate the bhuktis, we have to split the 12 signs for 1 year, 7 months and 27 days and distribute it equally to all the 12 signs. And in that case, the sub period or the bhukti or antardasha will be for 50 days. Like for example, if Aries is activated as a major time period, Aries will be active and Mars will rule that for 1 year, 7 months and 27 days. And we have to divide that 1 year, 7 months and 27 days and distribute it to all the 12 signs as sub-rulers. So Aries' rulership period will begin with Aries' activation, followed by Taurus, Gemini and so on. So the periods will be like Mars period, that is Aries period, Aries Taurus period, Aries Gemini period, and Aries Cancer and so on, just go cyclically. And the fundamental idea of how to begin the time lord period with chakra dasha is Parashara has given 3 rules. One rule is if the nativity is by day, the rulership begins from the sign in which the ruler of the ascendant is placed. So for example, for Aries rising, if Mars is placed in the 9th house of Sagittarius, the period begins from Sagittarius. The chakra dasha begins from Sagittarius and it follows the zodiacal order. And then the sub periods also begin from Sagittarius, Capricorn, Sagittarius, Aquarius, and so on. If the nativity is by night, the chakra dasha begins from the ascendant itself. So that's quite simple. And Parashara gives a 3rd rule for twilight birth. So if a person is born in twilight, the chakra dasha will begin from the 2nd house, from the rising sign. I kind of scrapped this rule because I thought that this rule was basically put in by Parashara because of the difficulty of calculating the exact day and night births, because we never know whether the sun is above or below the horizon, if it is very close, or if the birth is very close to the transition from the day to night. So
Yeah.
since the second house will rise next, um to become the rising, or if second house will rise in the east after the first house. So in order to kind of avoid any kind of mistake or an error, I think Parashara kind of gave this idea of twilight births, where second house will be the
Sure.
starting point for twilight births. But since we have enough calculation tools today to kind of find out if the nativity is by day or night, I think it probably makes sense to scrap the third rule, because we know the horizon exactly and we can find out the sun's position. So
Sure.
so that's the reason why I scrapped it. So I hope this is clear, right?
Awesome.
So this is the first war that we are going to talk about. Is the screen clear, Lars?
Yeah, can you enlarge it though? Can you enlarge the presentation?
Yeah.
So that just takes up the whole screen. Great. Excellent. Yeah, and you know, as we're jumping into this right here, you know, we do have sorry, I'm just going to jump ahead real quick so I can talk about this other thing. That basically the major period was ruled by Saturn, minor period ruled by Mars when this war began. Is that correct?
Yes, yes, yes.
And so I think this is kind of the third or fourth piece, depending on how you look at it, of the puzzle of these techniques with the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions, is that Saturn also is very important because it's the other major malefic.
Yeah.
And so in Jyotish, we know that Mars is a bitter enemy of Saturn. And Saturn naturally does represent longevity, continuity, stability, durability, traditions, right? And the ancient,
Yes,
blah, 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 antiquity, and so on. So, so it's important to analyze anything to do with Mars, Saturn in general in these charts in order to get a sense of, is that going to be disturbed? Is that longevity, continuity factor going to be disturbed by war or violence? Because that is often what happens in warfare, obviously. So,
right.
So, and here's a, you know, case in point where this particular war started under a Saturn Mars period. And, but yeah, I'll let you kind of take the wheel here, you know.
No, I think it's okay. Just go on, and I can add towards the end. Like both of us can offer the views. It's not an issue.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think if we start with the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction itself, as you pointed out to me when you showed me it, the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction itself, in general, occurred in the bounds of Mars in Leo, which is certainly not an auspicious place for Saturn and only quasi-auspicious for Jupiter, really. And the sun is also debilitated, the lord of this conjunction. So, of course, this is going to show us some general themes for the whole world at this point. But with this chart, we do actually have Sagittarius rising with the node very close to the ascendant. Which shows some upheaval for the country of France at the time. And it also shows the greed that you mentioned that's associated with Rahu, and the kind of shadowy nature of Rahu, where Rahu blinds people and it makes things, you know, appear as something they aren't. So this is a country during this conjunction, this 20-year period, this is a country that's not going to be really very clear in its direction, in what it's doing in general. And, I unfortunately, my history is not super great, so I don't remember exactly why they invaded Prussia, but you've written a little bit about it here, that France wanted to restore its dominant position in continental Europe. So this is like a clear case of greed, competition,
Power struggle, yeah.
and of course, when a nation has a nation chart like this has Rahu in the first, they're going to empower themselves.
Right.
Ketu in the seventh means they're going to reject or even destroy and lay waste to some other group, some other country, some other people,
Sure.
possibly even an ally or somebody they had a treaty or agreement with of some kind. Again, not
Right.
a direct ally, but and so we do have then the ascendant Lord Jupiter being, ready for war in the Martian bounds,
Yeah.
with Saturn, which is, weak, and the dispositor being weak, and also in the 11th shows that the intentions and the motivations of the country during this 20-year period are going to be some kind of grab for power,
Right.
gains, resources, and perhaps misguided idealism, which
And
I
also
think would be fair.
pettiness.
Pettiness, yeah.
Yeah, because the sun is fallen.
And a weak leader. Yeah, I think
Yes, yes.
a weak
Yeah.
ruler, a weak leader. That's shown a few different ways here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Obviously, not just because the sun is weak, because that would be the case for the whole world, but because the
Right.
sun is conjoined the midheaven, and the 10th house is afflicted by Mars, with its lord being also in the 12th house, afflicted by that placement, and opposing the moon. So the will of the people, what's good for the people, and so on. The leaders of France were not, in alignment with that at all,
Right.
during this period. Obviously, this 20-year period, and I'm sure if we were to go in and like really investigate all of the, socioeconomic, cultural movements of France during this 20-year period, we'd probably find a lot of these themes showing themselves more concretely.
Sure.
So as far as why warfare was sites, we do have that Mars in the 10th aspecting the ascendant very closely, Rahu with the ascendant, Mars very closely aspecting both nodes, right at the middle point of both nodes. So that emphasizes the Martian aggressive nature. It's not in a sign that's really great for Mars. So we can see this was a war that was really, just kind of nonsensical to fight.
Yeah.
Mars also is in the Jupiter bounds. And of course, that Jupiter can lead to a kind of expansive militarism. Sagittarius refers to warfare and militarism in general, expansion, like what we called manifest destiny in the United States, which is just like, oh, it's our destiny to just expand as much as possible and forget anybody that stands in the way. We'll just kill them and take their land and their resources, because this is our destiny. So, these are kind of the themes that stick out to me. There's not immediately to me a surefire kind of indicator of war, but there are little pieces that kind of point to it. And I think the final thing I'm noticing, and then I'd like to hear what you have to say, is that the moon is going to apply to to an opposition with Venus, but also a trine with Mars. That is what the moon is applying to, and it's very close, because we'd have to see too if by the time the moon got there, does the moon actually apply to Mars before Venus? And that would be interesting to take note of. But I think either way, we're getting a clear situation, a clear picture emerge, where just by the moon itself applying to Mars, pretty much next that is also showing a tendency towards violence or warfare on the part of the nation.
That's true. And
But of course,
followed by
that's
moons.
general. That'll be general
Sorry?
for the world. Sorry,
Yeah,
that'll
right.
be a general thing for the whole world.
Right, right, yeah.
But I think in the context of this chart, it adds another piece to these other
Good.
factors that's relevant. So
Okay. Now, I was just going to say that besides the aspect with applying aspects with the Venus and Mars, there is an inherent whole sign conjunction, square that Moon has with the Great Conjunction itself,
that's true.
which speaks volumes about the distress that the people of this particular region would have been facing by this time. So I don't have much to add, but I think one of the basic things that I would like to add here is Mars's position in the 10th house, and this if you see the reason for war, it's France's determination to restore its dominant position in continental Europe. So it's, and Mars in the 10th house. 10th house is power and authority, and Mars is all about desire. So Mars in 10th house is basically desiring power and authority.
Right.
So it's basically a power struggle that kind of led to war, and Mars is squaring both the nodes. So, and Mars also squares the ascendant, and Mars and Mercury are in mutual exchange. But the mutual exchange with the 12th ruler is not so auspicious. Like 12th ruler, talks about war and hospitalization. So the 12th lord is placed in the 10th house, which is basically the action, as you pointed out. So it's quite difficult to kind of find out whether if we were to predict the future, it would be difficult to say whether there will be a war or not, but I'm sure there are indications of war. So no one predicts a war beforehand. So, but the point we're trying to make here is that there are so many indications that a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction chart can lead an astrologer to kind of come to a reasonable, at least have a reasonable doubt that there is probably going to be a war. So,
and again, in this case, with fixing the ascendant for a particular country, and sometimes it may line up with a few different countries. Obviously, if we were using this technique to attempt to predict something going on currently, which is what we'll get to later when we talk about the Ukraine-Russia crisis going on, and I'll take on more specific significations, based on the ascendant. So the fact that Jupiter is the ascendant lord for this chart, for this nation at this time, right? It becomes more significant as a significator of the kind of actions and directions of the country. And so even though, yes, for all the world, Jupiter, Saturn are in the Mars bounds. Not for all the worlds is Jupiter going to. Sorry, not for all the worlds, not for all the countries is Jupiter going to be the ascendant lord. And any Jupiter Saturn conjunction is kind of interesting from a natal perspective, where Jupiter is creating a positive avashta planetary state for Saturn called mudita, which is delightfulness. But Saturn does the opposite. He creates shuddhita, which is like starvation, distress, draining. So in this case, France was getting the short end of the stick. Their ascendant lord Jupiter is being starved by Saturn, right? Yes. Their power is their 10th house, Mars, and so on is cadent because the midheaven falls in the next sign. So you see like a real sense of feeling disempowered, feeling disenfranchised or perceiving itself that way, which is not accurate because Rahu is afflicting the ascendant and the Mars. And so it's just all these things kind of line up.
I mean, ultimately it kind of shows greed and power struggle.
Yeah, greed and power struggle and feeling like, oh, I got the short end of the stick. look at Prussia over there, doing so well, and then like, what the heck, guys? Like, we got to get a piece of this, right? That's kind of the
Yeah.
vibe. And then if we jump over to your other chart,
Yeah,
when the
one
roughly
quick
when the
thing
war
that I wanted to
began.
mention about the war chart
Sure.
is I don't want the viewers to kind of have an impression that we have the time for the war. So this is just a
Okay.
random chart. There is no ascendant or something, but we just want to take the
Okay.
positions of planets and kind of view it with the natal chart and see how uh, it works. So yeah, just go on.
Cool. Yeah. Great. No, I did, and I didn't realize that. So thank you. I think the biggest things that you pointed out to me when we looked at this initially are the fact that the nodes have switched positions, which we talked about,
Yeah.
right? But by
Yes. Yes.
sign, that
Yeah.
is
Right.
really, I mean, yeah, that is a major trigger. And then the fact that Saturn and Mars are opposing one another is also important because again, that just causes disruption in general, in the world and whatnot um of traditions and longevity and continuity, right? So in the case of this chart, that Saturn is transiting the first house of the conjunction chart
Right.
set for Paris, and the
Yeah.
Mars is transiting the seventh. So this is like a pretty clear the 1-7 axis and whatnot. I mean, that this to me, yes, it's a pretty clear indication of warfare, and the
Yes.
nodes switching places, of course, just really adds to the whole thing.
Yeah.
And so yeah, it's really fascinating.
And the moon also is kind of squaring the nodes. If it squares the nodes, it squares Saturn and Mars in transit. And
Yeah.
just look at the action in the seventh house. It's uh, I mean, everything is basically quite literal, as you mentioned. We don't need a better indication of warmongering or actual war itself.
Yeah.
If we look at this chart, so yeah, I think so. I think we can
Yeah.
just move
Maybe
on,
go to
right?
the
So
next
I
one.
think I think I made a wrong thing here. It's not conjunction but opposition. Saturn
Opposition. Yeah.
was opposition. Yeah. So, yeah. So this is the First World War, and the preceding Jupiter and Saturn conjunction of the First World War. So
Right. And set for Sarajevo, Bosnia, right?
yes, 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 yes.
And that's it. And correct me if I'm mistaken, but that's where the Archduke was assassinated.
That's
Is
right.
that
That's right. That's right. I think I initially confused it with the Prussian War, but I think you were right.
okay?
So yeah, that's right. Yeah, go on.
Right. So in this case, it's kind of a unique situation, obviously, and my history is not super up to date once again, but there were, the way I learned it in high school, like a bazillion years ago, was that you know the Archduke Ferdinand was related to like several different families of different countries and their rulers, and they were kind of all related to each other in some fashion. And nobody liked him, and they kind of just some nation or something used him as like his assassination. They set it up as a scapegoat to start a war,
Yeah.
basically for various reasons, and most of them probably socioeconomic and old feuds and things like that. And
Right.
so anyway, if you're watching this and you know more about the war than me, you can probably fill in some of the gaps.
No,
But
just
this is interesting because if we focus on the conjunction for Sarajevo, Bosnia, I don't know that we're really focusing on the nation that was really at the forefront of the war. I mean, like, who really started the war, right? But
yeah.
then again, this was such a unique situation that it's kind of I think it's kind of hard to just choose one country, so to speak. Like I think on
Yeah.
some level, they all the major powers that fought, they all kind of wanted to go to war on some level.
Yes, the logic behind casting the chart for Sarajevo is that uh, I think it all started there as the Archduke was probably assassinated there. So,
Right.
and and the war actually began there. So that's
Right.
the reason
Okay.
why I chose the location.
Yeah. No,
Yeah,
I think it makes sense.
yeah,
And I think like this is one of those like nuanced interpretations, or a nuanced interpretation is kind of required. Maybe more thematic than than the interpretation we just gave for the previous chart. But I think yes, the fact that you have the ascendant in Aries ruled by our friend Mars
yeah. A friend Mars. Yeah.
with Ketu, again, this nodal
Yes.
thing being really emphasized. This time we have the reverse. And I
Yeah.
think, Bosnia, again, I don't remember exactly how they fit into the war, but I know they definitely got the short end of the stick. They did not come out of the war. I mean, obviously, no country came out of the war great, but
Yes. Right.
Bosnia didn't. Obviously, Germany didn't. And Germany and Austria were like one nation at the time. So, but a lot of what happened with Germany during this period is what led to World War II, or helped lead to World War II. And so here we have, like I said last time, if Ketu were in the first house of the nation, then the nation would be getting depleted in some manner, overridden, destroyed, and that kind of a thing. Where the other nations in their purview would be more aggressive with Rahu there, more having more to gain perhaps. And
Right.
with with Mars ruling this ascendant, well, I mean, again, we have Sagittarius is a war sign. It's
Yes.
actually, because it symbolizes all sorts of weapons, like arrows, missiles, things like projectiles, things like this, and conquest. So
Yeah.
the Saturn Jupiter conjunction occurring in the same sign as Mars for the entire world. I mean, it is so significant that there was this world war. And of course, it'd be interesting to see what happened in previous eras where the Great Conjunction took place in Sagittarius, and where Mars was or wasn't, based on what was happening. But
Yes.
Mars is, of course, so emphasized because it's the Lord of the Ascendant. And again, in this situation, we're having Mars is getting, helped by Jupiter, but hindered by Saturn. And of course, Mars is a bitter enemy to Saturn. So on another level, there's that to take into account. And of course, the moon opposing the whole configuration.
Yeah.
Um,
That's quite depressing. So.
yeah, it doesn't
Um,
blow people in general. And in this chart, the moon is, basically cadent. It's near the IC, but it's still basically cadent. So
and
this
one
is
more thing
again,
is like moon is also placed in the Martian bound, and the midheaven is
mhm,
also in the Martian bound of
yeah,
Sagittarius.
okay,
And the uh, like apart from that, I think we should notice the nodal axis again. Except the moon, all the other planets are on one side of the nodal axis. And as we mentioned earlier, the moon is invariably in relationship with every planet that is in the I mean on one side of the nodal axis. So yeah, just
yeah.
wanted to
So
kind of quickly
it's like a
point it out.
Kala Yoga
Yeah, it's
minus the
almost like one.
moon again.
Yeah.
Uh, so again, the nodes, they keep striking kind of a fatal blow. And in this chart in particular, we'll notice that Venus ruling the seventh of other countries, right, is actually
Yeah,
much more powerful than Mars, the ascendant lord,
right.
because Mars is cadent, whereas and whereas Venus is in Mars is in a friendly dignity, but so is Venus, and Venus is very close to the midheaven. It's in the 10th. Venus is arguably the most elevated planet here because it's the closest to the midheaven. Rahu is in the 7th. Mercury is in the 7th, and Mercury is just generally kind of quasi auspicious. So the point here, though, is that the 7th house, other nations have more power, are dominating the chart, arguably. So I think that's another kind of important piece here to this World War I puzzle and Bosnia and so on. It tells some important pieces of the puzzle. And like, if we extend this to all of Europe, if we kind of just take this as the chart for all of Europe during this 20-year period, which I don't think anyone could really have predicted per se. But looking back at it, we have some wiggle room. Again, this shows that really no country is going to benefit because of Ketu, right? It's going to seem like every other country, but your own is benefiting. Right, the people are going to suffer immensely.
Right. Depression and depletion are major themes. Yeah.
Yeah. And nobody, once again, the 5th deals with diplomacy and diplomats. And look at the 5th Lord, Sun is, in the 8th house and really not in aspect to any other planets, actually. A very wide sextile to Venus, but that's so weak. I mean, there's no diplomacy. None of the leaders are going to talk to each other, right? So essentially, you just have a bunch of leaders with their heads up their asses, and the 8th house indeed rules anus. So, it's like... and previous chart too in France, we also saw a similar thing with the 5th house where Mars was making a special 8th aspect to that 5th house and ruling it. And I think that also showed again, like no diplomacy happening.
Yeah, and I would also like to associate the foreign diplomacy with the 9th house. Because of the very nature of the 9th house being so associated with the foreign, and it's also trine to the 5th house. So for any kind of communication to take place between the nations or two parties, we need to have the yardstick or something to kind of bridge the communication. So here it's the 9th house is although Jupiter is dignified in the 9th house, but Sagittarius is also kind of always indicating war. And we have the war planet Mars there, and Saturn is also there. So we have conjunction of Mars, Jupiter, Saturn with midheaven in the bound of Mars. So it's a very depressing period. And one more thing is... Yeah, just go on.
Well, this is almost besiegement for Jupiter. The moon arguably interferes by casting an opposition aspect that interferes with Mars and Jupiter. But the thing is that this is a questionable interference to me, because the moon is cadent, and a conjunction is considered to be stronger than any other aspect traditionally in astrology. So Jupiter looks like it's sitting pretty in Sagittarius, but not really. It's an aversion to Venus, the other benefic, that could really help it. Mercury sextile doesn't, again, it exists, but it's cut off by Saturn. And then of course the sun can't help, moon can only barely help, and Mars is right there. So it's really amazing to consider that. Did you want to say anything else, or should we move to this other chart here of when the war started?
Like, just one point about Libra. Like, Libra is kind of natural sign of agreements and liaising and dealing with people. And with Rahu and Mercury, Mercury kind of facilitates communication. But with Rahu there, it kind of makes it very difficult, and Mercury's calculation turns into aggression, which makes it very difficult to kind of bring about any kind of a diplomacy. That's one thing that I quickly wanted to mention, because there won't be a conclusion with the node in conjunction with Mercury or the Moon. So it's very difficult for diplomacy to kind of win. And I thought we should just talk about the Time Lords a little bit. You spoke in length about Jupiter, but Mercury is placed in the 7th house, and Mercury rules the 3rd and the 6th house. So third house is the house of communication, and Mercury is placed in the 7th house, where it kind of wants to communicate and find a diplomatic solution, but still it is, Rahu kind of pulls Mercury's legs, and probably or even does something greater in terms of disrupting the idea of diplomacy or communicating with the other party. So it's not it's not an auspicious Libra to have as your 7th house. So and 6th house is the house of enemy in any chart. So I think I mentioned here so major Time Lord Mercury rules the 3rd and the 6th house and is placed in the 7th house. This is like enemy sitting in to spoil any future course of action and talks. So I think I mentioned very good. So this kind of further intensifies because of Ketu. Jupiter rules the 9th house, which deals with foreign diplomacy, and the 12th house, which is war. So we should not forget that Jupiter is kind of Jupiter has to play a balance between both diplomacy and war. But because Jupiter is placed in the 9th house and it is afflicted in its own territory, I think it killed diplomacy and promoted war. Probably if Jupiter was placed in the 12th house, and if it was afflicted, maybe the 12th house signification of Jupiter would have been killed. But I think that's more of a speculation. I'm not sure what might happen in real case, because 12th house is also a very difficult placement for all these planets, not just in the 9th house, but 12th house could also be a very difficult placement. So it's kind of a double-edged sword that we are dealing with here, as Jupiter rules both the 9th and the 12th house. So, and Mars is our friend who always likes war. He's a warrior planet, and Mars also rules the 8th house. So I'm not sure if we mentioned that, but Mars rules the 8th house and it's placed in the 9th house. Yeah, it's placed in the 9th house. So it's we don't need much more explanation to that, because 8th Lord in the 9th house again kind of brings about the death of diplomacy or foreign diplomacy. So and another ruler of the 5th house, that ruler of the 5th house, Sun, who also kind of helps in liaising and diplomatic solutions, is actually placed in the 8th house with no reception from Mars. So Sun is potentially very weak here. And another problem is Sun is placed in the bounds of Mercury, which rules the 3rd and the 6th house, which only kind of indicates another, it only indicates that talks are probably going to fail in any case. So quickly about the transit chart, like Mars is in conjunction with Mars is in conjunction with Ketu and opposes Rahu. So and Moon is also in conjunction with the Mars and the node.
Right. So again the node's getting kind of emphasized here.
Yes.
And I think regardless of the Time Lords, it's relevant because Mars is the ascendant lord,
right?
For the conjunction chart.
Yes.
But yeah, the
again, even in this chart, we cannot take the ascendant because we don't have the time. So just
right. That's right. Yeah. Thanks for mentioning that again. But I think, if we just take the major period, Gemini, Mercury, minor period, Sagittarius, Jupiter, the major opposition in this chart is getting activated, right? This is the only real opposition aspect happening in a chart. And of course, classically, opposition aspects refer to conflict, open
Yes.
conflict, us versus them, that kind of a thing. So you have the Gemini major period where the moon is getting activated, and
Right.
then the Sagittarius planets opposing it all get activated. So I think just the fact that the moon just, it just rules people in general, it's going to be kind of a major player in any mundane analysis. I know that's not the most profound observation, but
No, I think
that's what.
it's worth mentioning because it's a basic observation. So and quickly, like
Yeah.
earlier, I think we mentioned that a planet uh, that is on the other side of the nodal axis, like not with all the other planets on one side of the nodal axis, does play an important role if it is activated. So the moon, as it is placed in Gemini, which is activated, kind of forms an aspect with the planets in the ninth house.
Yeah.
I mean, we have Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars. So the moon potentially becomes a major planet in terms of coloring this particular period and turn it into black,
Right.
and create distress for people. So,
well, and I think
yeah.
particularly relevant too in terms of if we look at the transiting time lords that are activated. Well, you see
Yes.
Mercury at 5 degrees Cancer is opposing the conjunction Venus at 0 Capricorn. And of course, Venus rules the 7th house, Mercury ruling the 6th and the 3rd. In classical Jyotish makes it, malefic, basically, at stirring things up
Sure, malefic. Yeah.
for all the reasons you explained, the bad communications, the propaganda, things like that. So that's kind of an interesting thing to note. And then the other one, Jupiter at 29 Capricorn, ends up being in square to the conjunction chart Mercury at 25 Libra. So again, that is also, I think, worth noting as like a potential trigger, because again, Mercury's in the 7th, so it does refer to 7th house things. And I'm sure there's probably a lot more we could dig up, but I think I don't know. I think to me these are the most significant pieces. And sorry, one more thing I'll add is just that I just noticed at the time of the war, Saturn and Sun were transiting the major period sign of Gemini itself.
Yeah. Yes,
so that is also significant. More so Saturn, which had just moved in there, than the Sun, because Saturn is
it's basically opposing it's basically opposing its own position in the conjunction chart. Yeah.
And it's opposing Mars too, and it the houses it rules don't strike me as deeply significant in this analysis, but just the fact that Saturn coming into the picture is going to complicate things, and create more stress.
Right. Yeah. Sure. So I think I don't have much to talk about this. So if you're okay, we can just move to the World War II.
Okay, sounds good.
So,
and then maybe in a couple hours we'll get to the Ukraine thing.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Right.
Just kidding.
No, I'm sure. So I just want to quickly mention in the beginning itself that this particular war chart, we have the exact timing when Hitler actually ordered his troops to attack Poland. So it was 4:45 a.m. of 1st September of 1939. So that was the time that Hitler ordered the troops. I mean, the troops would start attacking Poland at 4:45 a.m. So,
wow.
So that's when So we have a clear, chart for war as well, which gives more scope for analysis. So I think we have a little bit, not little bit, but a far bit to kind of cover. So yeah. Here again, the World War II was towards the end of the Jupiter-Saturn cycle, which was for 1921, and we see Cancer was rising, and here we see that the nodal axis is Sagittarius, sorry, Pisces and Virgo, and most of the planets are actually placed in the axis itself, on the axis, and you see only Mars and Venus are away from it. So I don't see Venus in Cancer as a potentially good position, and neither this Sun Mars whole sign conjunction. But if you see the nodal axis, we have a lot of action here in the third house, where we have Mercury, Rahu, Saturn, and Jupiter. So, not a great place for Jupiter to be in its detriment. Saturn doesn't have much dignity except for its bound, but Saturn is placed in a friendly Mitru sign, and Mercury is placed in its own sign and also the sign of its exaltation. But the problem here is again the node. So the node kind of steps in to alter the balance. And one more important thing that we have to note here is that the moon is squaring the third house and the ninth house with a lot of action in the third house. So as I see, there is third house is the house of communication there, and there really was no communication that probably took place between Hitler and the other European countries. Probably Hitler signed a non-aggressive pact with Russia, which was then headed by Stalin. But I'm not sure if my history is not great to detail. So I'm not sure if Hitler really made any kind of a deal with any other country, but basically violated a lot of other earlier pacts or agreements that were signed at a global level. So Germany kind of were not ready to have any sort of communication. So that's what I think. And the major period was Taurus, and the minor period was Capricorn. So Venus placed in the first house, Venus ruling the fourth house, and the 11th house placed in the first house is not a very bad placement. But I think the third house and the 7th house of Capricorn, with the ruler of Capricorn, Saturn, placed in the third house along with Mercury and in the nodal axis, is probably a very crucial point that we have to understand here. So, and also the square of the moon with the nodal axis is really a troublesome period. And in general, moon placed in the 6th house indicates a really troublesome period for the people of that region, and in this case the entire Europe. And it also had a lasting impact for the next 2 or 2.5 decades. So because World War II was not a very it was not a very a passing cloud kind of a thing. So we know what happened in Japan, although it's not related to Germany or Berlin. But I think we should kind of go a little bit far to understand what kind of economic and social impact this world war had on people, and if that is particularly visible in the Jupiter and Saturn conjunction. So the moon squaring the nodes and Saturn, Mercury, and Jupiter, it's like we are talking about the 7th ruler and the 8th ruler. 7th house is the house of Maraka, and 8th house is the house of longevity. So 12th from 8th is death of longevity. So 7th house is basically Maraka, and 8th house is all about conspiracy, and 3rd house is communication, and 12th house is hospitalization and war, which is ruled by Mercury, which is ruled by Mercury. And 7th house is ruled by Saturn. So Saturn is always severe for Cancer natives, as it rules the 7th and the 8th house. We see the ruler of the 6th house and the 9th house, Jupiter, in conjunction with the Time Lord. So 6th house is diseases, death, and enemies. and ninth house is foreign diplomacy. So, and since because of, I mean, Saturn kind of restricts and puts some kind of a boundary or limitations
Yeah.
wherever it stays. So it probably kind of um, you know uh, cuts off any kind of communication that was possible
Sure.
during that time to kill the diplomacy. And with Ketu in the ninth house, it's very difficult to kind of enter into any kind of communication or diplomacy. So there is no communication or no talk that probably went on. So it's a
Well,
very yeah.
if I may too, like I
Of
really
course,
do
yeah,
think that the next conjunction chart, even though it occurred after the war officially started,
yeah.
I think it does show the war a little more obviously. My sense as I read this
That's right.
chart here is more, this gives us a lot of insight into more what was going on
That's
in
right. Yeah,
Germany at the time. The fact that, for example, the ascendant lord is the moon, right? And the moon naturally symbolizes the people, right? This is a whole like, Hitler propaganda, which started in the 20s, and his rise to power started well before obviously the war began. But this whole notion of like the common folk, the Volk in German, the Volkswagen, the common people's car, right, came out
yeah,
of this era and so on. And so, Hitler kind of pushed this rhetoric, and he pushed this rhetoric of like, ancient roots. And we see Rahu with the IC, they're very close to it, right? And I think during this time too, Germany, like if you notice, all the planets are below the horizon. Germany
yeah.
was very much involved in like strengthening its own position, its personal mythology that Hitler was developing.
Right.
It really kind of wasn't doing anything on the world stage because Germany was, heavily hit by the First World War, and they really they did have to, they all these supposed accords and stuff, but it really left them with very little way to redevelop themselves economically. They weren't even supposed to have a military, if I remember correctly. That was part of the accords or whatever that they signed. And so you do see, Saturn really closely squaring that moon ascendant lord in the sixth. This really does speak to a nation, first house, right?
Yeah,
Ascendant lord that feels disenfranchised and starved, and in a certain way, I mean, it was obviously,
right.
um, which is not an excuse for what happened, but it's a reason behind, one of the reasons why Hitler was able to rise to power and garner so much support. And Saturn is also, of course, the eighth lord, so the eighth is, and the seventh lord. So feeling disenfranchised by other countries, right? Feeling sapped of its resources in the eighth, and being a nation in ruin. I mean, Germany was literally in ruin, and people were, there's a wonderful film from like the, I don't know, maybe 30s or 40s. I think it's by Fellini or somebody like that. That really shows attempts to capture this, like the characters in the film. They're Germans. They're living in ruins, and they can, they barely get rations. They barely get anything. It's really an interesting film, and I wish I remembered the name, but so to me, this all shows that kind of like what was happening and that sort of rebuilding, and the emergence of a new and powerful leader, in the form of Hitler. We have the midheaven in the Gandanta position, right, the very last degree of Pisces, kind of
Yes.
transitioning us to the 10th house Aries, which is that emergence of a new leader. And Hitler himself does have an Aries sun in
Yeah,
sidereal, right? So
yeah,
we do see Mars, the 10th lord, and the sun, the natural significator of leaders, together. And Mars is not combust, but this is a very powerful Mars, right?
yeah. Right.
Um, and so we have this leader, Leo, Mars, Sun, emerging through an economic platform, the second house. And
Right.
this again was very appealing to the people and the nation as a whole because they're disenfranchised in the sixth house. And so you kind of see this like setting the stage for, I
Right.
think, what the
Yeah.
next chart more clearly
So for
shows.
me, the next chart was all about kind of, it was clearly depicting the current situation of Europe at that particular point of time, because we can imagine how a region would suffer if it is facing a war,
Yeah.
or living through a war at that particular point of time. So before we kind of jump onto that chart, I just wanted to quickly talk about uh, the war chart, because we have clear time. So just we probably spend 2 minutes or so talking about some of the major things that we can look at the war chart, because we have a rising. So again, we have Sun in Leo in the bound of Saturn, in conjunction with Venus, which also rules the 10th house. So it's a very telling thing, because this was a time when Hitler was really, he was completely on the aggressive without any kind of fear or hesitation,
Yeah.
uh, because he was riding on the backdrop of the peace agreement or non-aggression pact that he signed with Russia, hoping that Stalin would not attack, because his only threat at that particular point of time was Russia with its army. So since he had signed and they had some kind of a division to be made between the two of them, Germany and Russia, like with Poland. So they were trying to kind of take the Eastern Poland and Western Poland based on some kind of differentiation, but I'm not very sure about it.
Okay.
So Hitler was very aggressive, and Sun in the first house with Venus kind of shows a very aggressive leader. And I don't want to kind of paint a picture as if this chart is Hitler's or Germany's itself, but it's just the idea of the fact that Hitler began the war. And
Right. And we
so,
notice that the minor period ruler Saturn
yeah,
is fallen in Aries,
yeah, with the
decimated
node.
by this aspect from Mars with K2, which further kind of decimates its powers. And in the original conjunction chart and in the war chart, the start of the war chart, Saturn is ruling the seventh house. So this shows a weak point in Hitler's, not necessarily his enemies, but his targets, right? Other nations. And of course,
Right.
if I remember correctly, he orchestrated that a radio station would be blown up by his own people, and then so he could blame it on Poland.
Right.
And that's that excuse for starting the war. So we do kind of we kind of see some of that in the original chart with propaganda in the form of Mercury, the third lord, and just naturally being Mercury in with Saturn, the eighth lord.
And also Rahu, because Mercury and Rahu can kind of bring about false communication, and it kind of is deception.
Right.
Yeah.
And in the start of the war chart, Mercury is in the 12th, and the Lord of Mercury is in the 8th, which I think is interesting. It's worth noting. Mars is obviously super strong.
Yeah.
And in its joy, the sixth house being its joy, where it likes to sport and play and cause destruction or do whatever it does. And so those are kind of the things that immediately, I guess, jump out to me.
Right.
We don't have as much of a thing going on with the nodes except for the Saturn South node. So a little different from some of the other patterns we saw earlier.
Yeah, right. So maybe we can just look at this chart. Again, the major theme, so as we spoke about Kala Sarpa. So
this is a true Kala Sarpa. All the planets, including the moon, are within the 180 degrees of the nodes.
And it also, besides the war, I mean, it's obvious that we have war, but besides war, I think this chart kind of projects or indicates the socio-economic and socio-political condition of the entire world, not just Europe. So entire world itself. So, yeah, it's quite a difficult placement
Yeah.
for Saturn and Mars, especially in third and the uh, 12th houses. So the conjunction happens in the 12th house of war, uncertainty, and hospitalization, where Saturn is fallen
Yeah.
in the bounds of Mars, and Jupiter is also placed in the bounds of Mars. So obviously, that's the conjunction. And Mars is placed in Gandanta of the late 29th degree of Cancer, and it's fallen in
Yep.
Saturn's bound.
Yeah. So they're exchanging bounds
Yes,
too. Saturn and Mars exchanging
yes, right.
bounds.
Exchanging bounds.
Also, all these, Saturn, Jupiter, Sun, Mars in a volatile square aspect. They're
And as you mentioned, the
afflicted by
exchange of
Rahu.
bounds is also a very uh, telling fact to kind of determine that this square aspect between these two planets is actually very deadly.
Yeah. 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 I mean, I couldn't have a better chart, at least in terms of the zodiacal placements, to kind of symbolize the heinousness of the Second World War in full swing.
Yeah.
And I'm sure, we could. I mean, I think, yeah, there's so much here. I don't want to spend too much time myself
Right. Yeah.
talking about it, but I do think this really more accurately shows the heinousness that took place in the Second World War, for sure, just with that basic aspect there, that square between those four planets.
So, yeah, and to talk about the economic condition, Venus is placed in the second house, and it's again squared by the nodes, with the moon itself signifying people in the fifth house of the nodal axis. So this kind of explains that people were bereft of good lifestyle, and
Right.
the economic condition were pretty weak for. So except for the very rich people, I think the economic condition was very, very poor for most of the people in the world, at least in Europe, post the Second World War. So, and yeah, I think probably should we just move to the current scenario, because I think we spent some time, I mean, a good amount of time talking about the history.
So much time.
Yeah, it's okay. I think it's good to kind of provide historical reference and talk about the history with astrological references, so that we set a good foundation and just quickly move on. So this is the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction set for Moscow. Again, so the same idea is like if anyone attacks, it's going to be Moscow, so it's going to be Russia. And in the previous chart, we took it for Berlin, because in 1914 or something. So likewise, we're just going on. I think for World War II, we went with Warsaw, but here, if anyone attacks, it's going to be Moscow. So I thought it's better to kind of look at Moscow's Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. And there is not a great deal of time difference between Moscow and Kyiv. So they're in the same time zone. Yeah. Except for pound exchange. Yes.
Right. So that kind of makes things a little complex. But I think since Moscow, Russia is clearly the aggressor, I think it's fair to take them as actually the ascendant, right? To read this for Russia. And I mean, it already, some things jump out, like the fact of the matter of the lot of fortune being in Mars bounds and the 10th house, the 10th lord being Mars on the midheaven. Obviously, yes, Putin is on the warpath. The leader of the country, the 10th lord, is on the warpath, right?
Yeah. Right.
Whereas opposite, the Ukrainian president, Venus in a martial sign itself, but not so much necessarily on the warpath, more just concerned about war, I think,
Right.
Also in the 11th house from the 7th, this is a president that would probably rather things not
Yeah.
escalate,
Yes, yes.
rather keep an alliance or something like that potentially. But of course, with Ketu there, he doesn't have much, if any, power really. Mars is clearly the much more powerful aggressor significator here, and then the moon is the ascendant lord. What's interesting about this to me is that the moon as ascendant lord really is in Venus's exaltation, and Venus's bounds. It's almost like the Russian people are on the same side as the Ukrainian president in a sense, right?
Yeah.
I don't think the Russian people as a whole, at least based on this chart, are really interested in war. I think it's more just Putin. But Putin, Mars being in the Gandanta and in Saturn's bounds, in his hands are tied during this 20-year period in some form. So even if he does attack Ukraine, and I know it's really looking like that because he's got like 150,000 troops like right at the border all across Ukraine.
I think now it's 190,000 troops. So
okay, so he just keeps increasing it. I mean, it's getting absurd, and most people seem to be thinking, well, Putin is. Well, we thought he was posturing, right? Or maybe some of us knew he wasn't. I don't know, but he wants Ukraine similar to the way France wanted to invade Prussia, like we saw earlier. He wants Ukraine because it used to be part of the USSR. We used to have control over it. We want it back. There's no great economic or militaristic advantage, from my understanding, of taking back Ukraine. So this is really, really stupid to me. Okay. And probably to a lot of other people as well. The thing that I do like here is that Saturn, which is ruling in our analysis, the Ukraine as a country, is much stronger, at least in terms of dignity, than the moon, which is Russia.
Yeah, the idea is like. So I think Ukraine is kind of strong. They're putting up a very brave face, and Saturn's position in Capricorn is kind of quite descriptive of it. So Vladimir Zelensky,
defensive position, putting up kind of trying to put up a defense, right, a wall of sorts. The Russian president, the Ukrainian president is his significator is in a fixed sign, which shows the fixity of his position. Whereas Putin, being in a mutable sign and at the end of a mutable sign, is kind of wavering back and forth, obviously. So, but you notice too that, Mars disposits Venus. So on some level, yes, again, Putin has the upper hand, and they're in they are in trine to each other. So there is some communication happening, but as Mars has, obviously this was now like, a year and a half ago, this chart. So obviously this Mars has moved, across the zodiac by now, but symbolically speaking, this is kind of showing that once Putin moves into Aries, once Mars as Putin moves into Aries,
that's right,
there will be no more communications between the two. So the question becomes, does this create war or not? I mean, Mars will then be squaring Saturn and Jupiter, right? So that is, and again, already this happened by transits, but we're treating this more symbolically right now, right? So that is that to me is indicative of war. Yes, because Mars will be in the fall of Saturn, and Mars will have a certain amount of power over Saturn because Mars does rule Capricorn by exaltation. So
and Mars' position in 10th house is also all about action.
Very powerful.
Yes, very powerful. I don't want to get into the economic side of it. Probably if we had more time, I would have dwelled a little bit deeper into what economic sanctions are coming up, and I would have related with astrology. But still, just to talk about the second and 11th houses, we have the sun in the sixth house, and sixth house is not a very great position for the second lord. So, and
Right.
Mercury being the ruler of the third and the 12th house is also placed in the sixth house. So there is going to be some kind of loss. And as you pointed out, Saturn kind of as the ruler of seventh house and our symbolic Ukraine, Saturn is quite powerful. So it's Ukraine is not as weak as they might appear. So the loss that Russia might have to bear based on their attack or their invasion over Ukraine is going to be on a very large scale. So it's not very easy for Russia to handle this post-attack period. And moreover, there are a lot of economic sanctions. As it is, I'm not sure how sanctions are going to impact Russia. But looking at this chart from a cast to Moscow, second ruler in the sixth house, and the planet that Jupiter is money. Jupiter is placed in the seventh house, which is its fall, and Mercury, which also deals with some kind of money or transactions and all those things, is placed in the sixth house. So there is going to be some kind of economic distress. So Mercury's placement in the sixth house is indicative of the sanctions that the Western countries are imposing on Russia if it goes and invades Ukraine. So Mercury is all about agreements, and so if Mercury as the ruler, as a general significator of banking and all those things, Mercury is placed in the sixth house, and the West is threatening of imposing economic sanctions, which means basically cutting the trades off with Russia so that they cannot make much transactions, and the movement of money will be far lesser than what it is now, which basically will impact Russia and Russia's economy very badly. So that's probably the impact and the indication of the sanctions from an astrological point of view. But I don't want to spend too much time here. So go on.
Cool. Let me just add to that again. This is nearly a Kalasarpa yoga.
I wanted to mention it earlier, but I forgot. But Venus is
I forgot too. So I mean, Venus is the only one outside. So there's at least a shred of diplomacy escaping.
That's what I think. So
the grip of the nodes, but unfortunately, Venus is applying to Ketu, and Ketu is applying to Venus within 12 degrees, which is kind of like, according to Mashallah, the hot zone for a nodal influence by conjunction. So yeah, it's kind of a fleeting thing there, that vision sort of diplomacy and stuff in general. But do I think, I don't know, I guess what I'm thinking is like, is this a chart that could show World War III in terms of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, regardless of the ascendant? And I'm not so sure. I think it is, because I really see this Mars in Gandanta as being indicative of any wars that happen in the next 20 years. There's going to be a lot of push pull, start stop. It's almost like a nuclear standoff kind of thing. And I just don't see this as being nearly as horrendous looking as the chart we saw for 1940, where you had the
1940 was very but for me if the problem is when we look at the time lords, and when we kind of put the transits in place, it looks very bad. So I think we'll just go and talk about the time lords first, and then we'll also talk about a little bit of transits, and then just get back to what we think. So So it's Cancer and Pisces period. So Cancer is the first house and Pisces is the ninth house. So Cancer is the first house and Pisces is the ninth house. So it's not a very seemingly it's not a very difficult period because it's the activation of the first house and the ninth house. But still, if you look at the lords of the first house and the ninth house, it becomes obvious that why we are all concerned about it. Because Moon, being the time lord, is placed in the ninth house of Pisces and is in a conjunction with Mars. It's not a very close conjunction, but it's a whole sign conjunction. And we may have to be worried about it because Mars rules the 10th house. However, the problem that we see here is the dispositor of Mars and the Moon in Pisces is Jupiter, and Jupiter is in a very bad distressed state. And seventh house is the house of Maraka, and Jupiter is in conjunction with the Maraka ruler. So it's basically the Maraka of diplomacy. So I don't see this talks going any further as we kind of approach the Saturn and Mars conjunction by transits. And I also think Mars' entry into Capricorn will change the course of actions.
When Mars enters Capricorn. Oh, am I back?
Sorry?
Okay. When Mars enters Capricorn, and especially as it transits the natal positions here and then makes an actual in-sky conjunction with Saturn, indeed, that could easily trigger the start of a war with Russia invading. Yeah.
And quickly, like Moon is the ruler of the ascendant. So it kind of, Moon is placed in the ninth house, and it's kind of evident that Putin wants to talk because Putin does not want war as much as any other European country. So because he knows the kind of economic impact that his own country will have. So Putin was probably ready for talk, but I'm not sure if he's still ready to talk. But one thing that is for sure is that Putin is not going to compromise until he gets what he wants, because the Saturn Moon aspect kind of makes the Moon very adamant, and also the Moon Mars whole sign conjunction with reference to MC in Pisces makes or kind of indicates that Putin means business and he's not joking. So he really wants what he wants.
But I don't necessarily think Putin really knows what he wants, though, because
that's another way of seeing it, because we see the Moon is distressed.
Well, and the fact that Mars is disposited by a fallen Jupiter.
Yeah.
It's like what his intentions are basically coming out of a place of self-pity or victimhood, or feeling like he deserves something that he doesn't currently have, like a sense of
basically power struggle.
A sense of ignorance, dukkha. There's a sense of emptiness. So it's kind of interesting. That's why I say he doesn't really know what he wants, because his intentions, which the way I do intentions is I just take the Lord of the significator in question as like what's behind the person's actions. And this is a really shit Jupiter, and these planets are even becoming cadent from the descendant. They're pretty much cadent at this point. So it's just kind of interesting. I have no great love for Putin, obviously. But just trying to be objective here as possible, like this Jupiter describes his intentions. That's not a strong basis for doing anything or acting. And it arguably means too that whatever victories he obtains during this 20-year period are going to be very hollow, shallow, and possibly not have much longevity.
I don't see any kind of victory here because of even if he invades, he will just take a portion of Ukraine, but it's not going to yield him anything because of the
No.
economic distress that Russia is going to face. And the economic distress is probably a major theme of this chart, more than the war. But something should kind of lead to the economic distress, because if the war doesn't happen, Putin will be able to maintain his economy. So
Yeah, I mean, but if we look at like too, if we just take, for example, real quick, the eighth house as like a possible house for war, and we look at the 11th from the eighth, it's ruled by Jupiter, gains from war, and again, that same Jupiter is shit.
yeah, yes, that's right. Yeah.
You know, and we also have again the second lord Sun in that same position, the 11th from the 8th and the 6th house, and it's just not, you know, it's like saying, like, again, whatever is gained economically from this is not going to be really all that beneficial. And it's also, these planets are square the moon, so it's certainly not really going to help the people, which is no surprise anyway, because, you know, it's
So,
it's not
and
that kind of
moreover, given the fact that Pisces is activated until the end of March, and with Jupiter fallen, it looks like there is very less scope for talks.
Right.
And
yeah, whatever's gained will be damaged, will be somehow partially lost, will
right.
not have much staying power or longevity. And so I don't know that Russia will do significant damage to its economy by going to war.
Yeah, in all practical sense, yeah.
I don't see any evidence of that. I would like that to be the case, because I mean, if they're gonna go to war, I would, you know, some part of me would love to see that blow up in Putin's face, and then it, you know, it creates an economic crisis that he then is forced to deal with, and it kind of just,
I mean, he
screws
is going to
everything
be
up.
forced to deal with, because that will be the result of the war. So there is no doubt about it.
Yeah.
And for me, as we mentioned earlier, like Jupiter-Saturn conjunction is all about the major shifts in socio-political and socio-economic progress. And here it looks as if there is going to be some kind of a socio-economic shift because of something geopolitical.
And it's just not, it's not a good, I mean, overall, to me, this is not a strong 20-year period for Russia.
Right.
For the Russian economy, for the Russian people, for the Russian global power, for so many reasons that we've already said, but especially because, you know, again, first lord is cadent, the dispositor is afflicted, right? The same dispositor, Jupiter, rules the sun, which is also the second lord of the economy, and it's afflicted by virtue of being in the 6th with the 12th lord and very close to Ketu, though it's out of sign, it's still fairly close. And you know, when you have both luminaries cadent in the life of a person, it creates it sets the foundation for a lot of hardship, a lot of health problems and things like that. In a country's chart for a 20-year period, this is not a chart that shows Russia being a world power in the next 20 years in any way that's beyond where they are right now, to me. Right. And arguably they're gonna take a loss over this 20-year period. So
no, I mean, if Russia invades, I think they can forget their hope of becoming a superpower for next 100 years or so. So
yeah, probably. I mean, and again, other nations, Saturn, other nations, right?
Other nations
is the strong, arguably the strongest planet, at least by dignity, in this whole chart. Yes. And even though it's cadent, it's not fully cadent to me. It's 11 degrees from the angle that, you know, I give about 15 as the wiggle room. So yes, some of the other countries that Russia's concerned with may not have the full-blown power as the 20-year period progresses compared to dealing with Russia, but it still has that nice dignity of being in its own sign. And so that is something that I don't think Russia can't really beat that. It
Yeah.
just can't. The moon ruling its ascendant is disposited by an afflicted Jupiter, and the moon is cadent, so very cadent, much more cadent than. And anyway, I'm kind of rambling, but so
No,
so
no.
let's move to the next part.
So before
That
coming to
sounds good.
Capricorn Ingress, I think we'll just look at the conjunction chart with transits of April 2022. So,
Okay.
uh,
So this is when the nodes switch signs, Jupiter switches signs, and Saturn is about to switch
this is
signs.
close
So
to, yeah. I mean,
this is
yeah.
a hugely important set of transits for those of us who are dedicated to Jyotish and the sidereal tradition. I have actually predicted for several people I know certain key changes because of these three major transits.
Right.
So this might be the most important period of the whole year, and maybe the most important period for the next 19 months or so, because that's roughly the time it takes the nodes to go through a sign, if I
Right.
remember correctly.
Right.
So
Yeah.
um,
So, see, I mean, we already saw the Jupiter Saturn conjunction chart, but I just want to quickly point out the 10th house through transit,
yeah,
and the relationship that Saturn here, the nodes here, the 4th and the 10th axis have with Saturn in the 7th. So all
right. Saturn
in the
squaring the
29,
nodes.
yes, 29 degrees squaring the nodes. And
Yeah, that's important.
yes, for me, one saving grace would probably be Jupiter entering the 9th house of Pisces.
Sure.
But I'm not sure
But
how
that's empowering to. The problem with that is a double-edged sword. That's empowering to Russia because we're taking
yes.
Moon as first lord. So Russia gets a boost there, a boost.
No, on the other hand, I also
perhaps.
think that it might lead to more talks, further talks, and delay war. And probably if things work out well, there will be no war.
Okay.
So, but that's just a very small thing that we can kind of hope. But looking at this, so the node, as the node makes its entry into Aries, so it kind of squares the 7th house of the Jupiter and Saturn conjunction chart, which is very stressful as far as I see. And so I think by this time Mars would still not have kind of made its way to conjunct Saturn, which happens at a later stage of April. But I think this chart is quite telling in terms of what might actually turn out, because if you see the 8th house by transit, we have Venus, Mars. So Venus and Mars are, Venus is capable of kind of handling the diplomatic matters well. Although it is also a warrior, I think it has its other side of to kind of promote diplomacy and enter into talks. But its conjunction with Mars in the 8th house by transit is a little bit worrying for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And also just the fact that, again, the 8th house is definitely at least one of the main houses for war.
Yes.
When Saturn enters that 8th house, if war hasn't already begun due to the earlier conjunction of Saturn and Mars, then I do kind of wonder if that won't be another possible turning point. So you have a few different triggers here, right? Saturn entering in the 8th, Mars conjoining Venus earlier before this chart was cast, and then also in the 8th, and then also when Mars eventually makes its way to square the nodal axis in Scorpio Taurus in the conjunction chart itself. That could be yet another trigger. With all this nodal stuff going on, it does make me wonder, though, if there could be some sort of strange sudden shift, either the diplomacy you're talking about, or if there's like a strange sudden shift of Ukraine making the first strike, perhaps by accident, by some sort of
or probably orchestrated like that by Russia.
Yeah, or some sort of misinterpretation of the data and the commands. And then, Saturn will go retrograde later in the year and back out of Aquarius, back into Capricorn. And I think if there's any validity to what we're doing, then there will probably be a shift at that time as well, where maybe there will be a ceasefire if there is a war going on, or there will be some sort of withdrawing of the troops from both sides. I'm not, not totally sure.
Right.
But do we get the Aries period is
Yes,
starting
we have Cancer
in
and Aries
April.
period. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So that's also very significant because of the whole sign conjunction between Mars and Moon, obviously, in the original chart. But then we also have to look at the Moon Mars transits and whatnot. And Moon is so swift right now, as you've drawn it up, it's squaring that Venus,
Yeah,
which is obviously not great for level-headedness or real diplomacy. It's kind of more hurt pride, hurt feelings, and too many ideals perhaps interfering with one another. But
yeah,
again, if we watch Mars as sort of the minor period ruler, when Mars goes to, if it's still the Aries period when this happens and Mars gets to 25 Aquarius, like I said, it's going to square those quote unquote natal nodes. That could be yet another volatile sort of triggering point. But I do think, yeah, this might be the most volatile period ahead with all of these things happening.
yeah. So, I mean, we see that currently it's quite volatile, but still I think it will get more volatile as we enter this Cancer Aries period from April.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So now probably we'll move back to Capricorn Ingress in Moscow. So we have, if you see this, you look at the Aries rising, which is
yes. Okay.
so
with Mars in the 8th house.
Mars in the 8th house with Ketu, and Moon is with Rahu. Although Moon is dignified in Taurus, but the conjunction with Rahu and opposed by Mars and Ketu is not a great thing to have. And it also squares Jupiter in Aquarius, which is yet another big conflict in terms of any kind of diplomatic solutions that Russia would want to have.
Sure.
Probably one good thing is that Moon and the nodes do not have a hard aspect with the Moon. So and also the Mars. So that's one comforting thing, but I'm not sure how far it's going to lead us. With the nodes so prominent in the 2nd and the 8th house, and quickly,
and once again, almost a Kalasarpa
nodes,
yoga.
Yeah, almost a Kalasarpa. That's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
So it's a. And
so
one
yeah,
more,
this doesn't bode too well for Russia's general attitude this year or this quarter.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and so without getting into too big of an analysis of it, I think the things you've pointed out just kind of reinforce some of the themes we already saw, just more in terms of at least Russia's kind of attitude about things.
Right.
Although I do like that Saturn, which is now ruling Putin, in its own sign and in the bounds of Venus, it's already, Capricorn is a friendly sign to Venus, and Venus again could signify Ukraine being the 7th lord. So there might be, I don't know, we haven't really seen that yet though, and we're well into this ingress. We haven't seen too much of Putin.
I think Venus is retrograde in 9th house, and it's kind of closely conjunct the MC. So this kind of has to mean something. And Venus being
that's a good point.
The ruler of diplomacy. I think I'm not sure if this kind of indicates going back to war or going back to diplomacy. So since Venus's major signification is diplomacy, I think I would assume it's diplomacy.
It's also good because it's moving away from its combustion with the sun.
Right. Yeah.
They're moving in opposite directions, so it's getting out of a sticky situation.
Right.
So that's kind of good. And then obviously, if we take the fourth house as the 10th from the 7th, showing the Ukrainian president, Moon Rahu is not great, but at least the moon is exalted and in the bounds of Jupiter. So and in trine with Putin's significator, very close trine there. Though there's no real reception happening, it's at least a beneficial aspect. So I mean, this kind of this is probably why, though, after April, you know, I know we're using sidereal here, but when we get into the Aries ingress, at least according to sidereal, that'll be sometime in April.
Yes.
And so so that would be probably a more likely time again, because I don't see a conflict really escalating here. Totally.
Yeah, that's the point. But I think it's kind of building up to a major thing.
Yeah.
Probably. So did we kind of miss anything here, like, or no?
I don't think we missed anything really huge.
Right, yeah. Okay. So Saturn Mars conjunction, and just make note of this Kala Sarpa quickly.
Once again.
Yeah. So. Yeah. So it's
going to be a while before the Kala Sarpa really weakens in general for the world.
Yes. Right.
Kind of a ways to go, but Saturn Mars, so set for Moscow.
In the ascendant.
So yeah, I mean, Russia is holding all the chips. Not all the chips, all the cards with that. So Saturn.
Can you
Mars
see this one interesting shift from the Jupiter Saturn conjunction to Saturn Mars conjunction? Is in Jupiter Saturn conjunction we have the Capricorn as the 7th house. In Saturn Mars conjunction we have Capricorn as the 1st house, which puts Saturn and Mars in the 1st house itself. So it's kind of
right.
Russia is almost ready for war and
very powerful. Yeah, ready to go.
Powerful. Both Saturn and Mars are dignified.
Yes, very dignified. Oh my God.
Very dignified.
In Mars bounds there.
Yeah, Mars in its and Mars is in its own bound. So it's even more powerful. So and the ascendant is very tightly conjunct. It's not even a very far off conjunction. It's very close conjunction. So it seems to be a big distress, but. And see, I would have really liked the moon to be somewhere away from all these things, but moon is also placed in the nodal axis, and despite its exaltation and the reception that it receives from Venus, I think
it's weakened. I mean, the square to Venus, even with the reception, is weakening. The conjunction with Rahu is very weakening. Yeah. So this is a weak point in.
And I think the conjunction with, I think that square with Jupiter, although it's a far off thing, I think it also kind of weakens the moon to some extent.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing that's good here is that Mars and Saturn are not square to anything. Or opposing anything. The 8th Lord and the 6th Lord sit there together in the 3rd house, Sun, Mercury, but they're not opposing or squaring anything.
Yeah, no.
And so this chart by itself, I don't think is still quite enough to go to war, but I think if we look at it in the context of the other chart, this is the precursor, right? Because when all that stuff then enters into the 8th house, Saturn, Mars, and the nodes shift signs, I think that's going to be more the trigger point, you know?
Right. Yeah.
That's more the trigger point if war is going to happen. And
just Jupiter and Venus are squaring the nodes. So
Yeah, Venus more closely.
Yeah,
So that also again doesn't generally bode well for diplomacy, and Venus ruling the 10th, showing Putin not a great position for the leader to be in to make cogent
right.
decisions.
I mean, I
This is
think
very
this
much a
chart kind of uh, puts Russia in a more powerful position, and
yeah,
and there is more clarity in the thought, like because currently it looks like uh, Russia is not very clear about what it wants to do, but probably by this time Russia would be clear in terms of what it wants to do. So
right.
yeah. So just moving on. So I think we'll just skip this Macron and Moscow,
Okay.
and we'll just look at Jupiter Saturn conjunction for Cave as the last thing that we
Okay.
are looking at. So the I know it's getting too late for you, so I think we'll just close it out
We'll
here.
wrap it up here. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. So the point that we have to look at here is that there is no much change because of the same time zones.
Yeah.
But a significant thing that we have to notice here is that uh, on the left we have Kiev, Ukraine, and on the right we have Moscow. So we have the MC in conjunction with Mars for the Russian chart, but for Kiev we see that the MC has shifted into the 10th house of Aries.
Yeah.
Uh, like one good thing in Cave's chart that we can say is that the midheaven is not in conjunction with Mars. I mean, the hole's in conjunction with Mars anymore.
Right.
But it kind of carries another difficult thing by squaring the Saturn and Jupiter in Capricorn, uh, which is
Yeah.
a bigger conflict in my opinion. So,
Huh. Interesting. Yeah, it could be. I mean, especially since Aries is the sign where Saturn falls. So
right.
it kind of makes for more stress in that sense. And this obviously puts a lot of stress on the, Ukrainian president if we just kind of take
Yeah.
this as, him again. And I would use, in this case, though, I would use the sun as the exaltation lord in
Right.
contrast to what we used Mars in the Moscow chart.
Right.
Partly because Mars is in a version and the sun is casting a nice trine to that
Yes. Yeah.
midheaven.
Sure. Sure. Sure.
So, and it also gives us some differences between the two charts, more subtle things. So, um, again, like this isn't an empowered position for the Ukrainian president because his significators in the sixth, with the 12th Lord and with K2 nearby. But it is in a Jupiter bounds, and the sixth house is also does have to do with, like, in general, like poor people, disenfranchised people. So I think on some level his thinking is on those kinds of people, and his intentions are also controlled by Jupiter, just like we saw for Putin's intentions. So again, I don't know much about him, but just from this, I would question also in some ways some of his intentions during this 20-year period
Right.
as a leader, but I don't know as much about him, and we're also mostly looking at this for the possibility of war.
Right.
But it's clear that both leaders of both countries have a similar foundation in terms of what I'm calling intention. It's not the best word for it, but they're kind of the inner thing motivating them in this situation is like a sense of lack, a sense of being denied something or defeated in some capacity.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
yes.
And one more interesting thing is like there is not even a subtle change except for the MC because
Yeah.
the moon is placed in the same 12th part as well as the Moscow chart. So
And even the same Navamsha, if this is really
yeah, sure. Navamsha
accurate,
is
it's kind of
same.
funny. Yeah, but the the degree itself is different. So I guess if we wanted to get down to like the Shastyamshas or degree symbols, we
Right, yeah,
could,
monomorias,
we could kind of go crazy. Yeah, monomordias and all that. So
yeah, I think we'll leave the crazy part for some time later. And
yeah, cool.
Finally, I think we are able to look at each other's face. So, uh, see, I think it's quite difficult period. I mean, the time frame is very difficult, and but whether or not it kind of would lead to war, but I think it might actually lead to war, but a very short-lived one.
Sure.
It's
I don't think it'll be a long one.
Yeah. But even if it is a short one, I think Russia's economy is going to, be buried for quite a while. But still, I think unfortunately it's a war. No one wants war, but unfortunately, it looks like, for me, astrologically, it looks like there might be a war, but I hope there is not one. So, I mean, that's the best hope.
Yeah, and I don't see World War III.
No, it's not a World War III, but I think it's going to be. It's certainly not World War III, because no country wants to go for war now. But I think it will be only Russia and Ukraine if there is something. But I hope there is not.
Yeah, same. So it'll be a fascinating learning experience for both of us, and especially for you, who really like spearheaded all this research and put all this together. It'll be really, really interesting to see what more you find and notice, and how your theories develop. But I do think this is a wonderful way to do mundane astrology. Personally, I really like it so far. So,
sure, thanks. So, I think there's been a great deal of learning, especially since I started putting out the charts and started analyzing all these things. There's been some learning, but I think you have come into this before 2 weeks, so I'm sure you have seen some of these things shape up and how it works. So,
sure.
So more than just a prediction of war, I think I hope this discussion turns out to be educative for someone who wants to do mundane astrology at a more specific level. Sorry. Rather than just dealing with transits and trying to predict things. So a Time Lord kind of gives more assertion, and especially in the context of a Jupiter and Saturn conjunction chart. So
and this is a useful technique, I think, for clients too, because if a business owner comes to you, for example, and they're facing economic hardships that are tied directly into the country's problems, right? You can use this technique to try and predict when and if and when the economic issues will resolve itself, and tie that into the person's chart. I mean, there's so many ways that you could use this technique as an astrologer, and especially for client work. So that's what's also very cool about it.
For me, I'm actually the one thing that you mentioned about dealing with business and making forecasts for business is one thing, and I'm also thinking about answering questions about international relations and global politics with this by kind of comparing the charts and putting time frames and time lots for various charts. So I think that kind of brings us towards the end of this very long session.
But really enjoyable.
But I'm so sorry that it's too late for you there, but I think I really appreciate your presence for being able to join me for this and just help me work out things. And I think we did it in a very reasonably good manner to kind of put things out to the people, especially those who want to kind of learn the technique and all those astrological enthusiasts. So thank you so much. And
it's been a pleasure.
So I hope we all are headed towards peace.